So this is the second lecture on the reproductive system. So you make sure that you watch the first lecture video first. So you've hit puberty for if you're a male, and so now what happens now is now you have high levels of secrete, like relatively speaking to when you before puberty, of gonadotropin releasing hormone. So gonadotropin releasing hormone, the purpose of the gonadotropin releasing hormone in this case is to stimulate, again, obviously GnRH comes from the hypothalamus, is to stimulate the anterior pituitary to actually release two hormones called follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Follicle and luteinizing are actually terms more appropriate for females, but they have carried on with this, in this case, with this nomenclature, so we're going to keep at it, okay? And the purpose of the follicle stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone actually has two different functions, okay? So the luteinizing hormone is actually the most important hormone as far as I'm concerned, because what that is they actually, in this case, stimulate, in this case, interstitial cells, also called Leydig cells, to manufacture testosterone. So this LH actually is responsible for the creation of testosterone, okay? However, the problem with testosterone is it actually has a very, very low serum life, because testosterone, I don't know if you know this, is actually, in this case, a non-polar hormone. So what happens is it actually gets readily diffuses out of this environment. So one of the things that the FSH does, which is quite important thing, is it stimulates sustenicular cells, and sustenicular cells are also called Sertoli cells, to manufacture this thing called androgen binding protein. And androgen binding protein, all it does is it binds testosterone. So if it binds testosterone, it keeps the levels of testosterone high in the testes. Okay, and high amounts of testosterone in the testes stimulate sperm production. Okay, so what happens is, if your sperm production, and there's actually a very, very interesting thing, is actually around 20 million cells, 20 million to 100 million cells per mil. Wow, right, that's a lot, correct? All right. So what happens is, once you reach the threshold, once you make enough sperm, there is a negative feedback, okay, which is through inhibin. Okay, so the sustenicular cells obviously are the ones who can detect how much sperm is, because these are seminiferous tubules, and that's actually where sperm actually gets produced. Okay, sperm does not get produced here. Okay, so it actually gets produced in the seminiferous tubule. Once there is a high population of sperm, the sustenicular cells then, in this case, secrete inhibin, and this in turn obviously turns off, because of negative feedback, the whole HPG pathway. This is actually the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal pathway for males. Okay, so make sure you understand that whole cycle. Again, GnRH, LH, FSH. LH, in this case, induces the creation of testosterone. FSH makes sustenicular cells secrete androgen binding protein, which keeps testosterone in the testes. Once there is enough sperm that's created, then there's basically a negative feedback loop that actually travels to the hypothalamus, shutting out, not shutting off, but in this case, decreasing the amounts of these hormones that are circulating in the system. Okay, very, very important. And again, the purpose of this thing is spermatogenesis, or the creation of sperm. For females, it's females are definitely much more complex. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to skip to the slide, and if you need to look at the slide in a better level, what you can do actually is you can read on the slide, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to stick with a much more complicated slide, which is this slide. Now, a very, very important thing that you have to do here is you need to understand what happens first. Okay, so obviously the whole thing here is about gonadotropin releasing hormone. Okay, so what happens is, and again, and a very, very confusing thing here is, the confusing hormone here is estrogen, because estrogen exerts a negative feedback, but can also exert a positive feedback. So we're going to talk about that soon. So the confusing thing is going to be about estrogen. Okay, so gonadotropin releasing hormone, similar to males, is secreted from the hypothalamus, which then obviously in this case, induces the secretion of FSH and LH from the anterior pituitary. And what happens is this is actually the levels, the circulating levels of FSH and LH in the blood. Now, I want you to understand that this is based upon a 28-day cycle. Okay, now obviously there are some females who have longer cycles, there are females that have shorter cycles. So this is talking about a 28-day cycle. Okay, so what happens is at the early levels of the release of gonadotropin releasing hormone, amounts of FSH and LH actually are secreted from the anterior pituitary, with the FSH levels being higher. As you can see here, this is red, FSH level is higher than the luteinizing hormone. Okay, now interestingly speaking, all right, as you can see in response, obviously the female gonad, which is the ovary, secretes low levels of estrogen and progesterone as well, but primarily about estrogen. Now, why does the ovary secrete small amounts of estrogen at this period? And the reason why that is because the follicle is actually quite small at this point. All right, so the size of the follicle determines the amount of estrogen that is produced. Okay, so and FY, ladies and gentlemen, follicle is actually a structure in which you actually have the follicle, in this case, actually protecting the egg inside. So the follicle and the egg, the follicle inside, and so you can see the ova is actually inside. So the follicle is a structure with an egg inside, and the follicle is a protective, and we're going to talk about the reason why that is probably in a few minutes here. Okay, so very, very important. So if the follicle is very, very small, what happens is it excretes very, very small amounts of estrogen, and that actually is a negative feedback loop to gonadotropin releasing hormone. So in the first half of the female ovulatory cycle, or the ovarian cycle, whatever you want to call it, estrogen actually exerts a negative, okay, a negative feedback to the hypothalamus. However, as you can see, as the days in the ovulatory cycle, when the ovarian cycle actually progresses, the follicle eventually grows in size. Now again, the bigger you are, the more estrogen you create. All right? So since the mature follicle now, in this case, is now huge, okay, relatively speaking, compared to a secondary or primary follicle, there's a spike in the amount of estrogen that is actually produced by this follicle. This spike in the estrogen levels, due to the large size of the mature follicle, now exerts a positive feedback loop to the gonadotropin releasing hormone. So around almost like the midway point, estrogen now flips from an off switch to an on switch. And the spike in the estrogen levels, okay, now becomes a positive feedback loop, right? And I should do that in green so that it's positive feedback. This spike, right, now stimulates, this is terrible, the hypothalamus to secrete a high amounts of, in this case, primarily speaking, primarily the anterior pituitary, that induces the release of, if you look at this green thing, what has happened to the anterior pituitary? What is the spike here? This spike, ladies and gentlemen, is an increased level in, what's that green hormone? Luteinizing hormone. So before, FSH was the dominant hormone. Now, because of high estrogen from mature follicle, now it's basically the whole thing is flipped. Now it's luteinizing hormone that's actually the dominant thing. And the reason why luteinizing hormone is very, very important is the spike in luteinizing hormone, as well as FSH, albeit in a smaller level, induces ovulation. And ovulation is just the term in which the mature follicle expels the mature egg. Okay, so that's what ovulation. Now, because the egg is now outside this protective confines of the follicle, now it can be fertilized by sperm. Okay, so now ovulation occurs. Okay, And what happens is, so this was called a follicle before because it had an egg in it. Now what happens is, now this structure keeps developing without the egg, and it's now called the corpus luteum. And the reason why it's called luteum is because it's yellow. All right. Now the corpus luteum, ladies and gentlemen, in turn now secretes high amounts of progesterone. Okay. And there is an effect, okay? There is actually an effect of progesterone to the walls of the uterus, okay? In this case, we're actually looking at, this is actually the endometrial layer. Endo meaning the inside layer. And the endometrial layer, there's actually developments that's actually happening. And so what happens is, due to this high amounts of progesterone, what happens is beforehand, if you look at it, the walls of the endometrial layer actually becomes thickened, and there's a high amounts of vasculature. And actually, one of the important things is there's actually high amounts of secretion, high in sugars. And the reason why it's high in sugars is because just in case this egg gets fertilized, you need nutrients when the actual egg gets implanted deep in the endometrial layer. Okay, so this is preparing for the delivery of a fertilized egg. If you get pregnant, okay, which means to say that an egg gets fertilized, what happens is the corpus luteum eventually, in this case, will die off without this. What happens is in this case, the zygote, or the newly fertilized egg, okay, actually secretes HCG. So the egg now, so let's say you have a fertilized egg. Let's say that this didn't happen. Now you have a fertilized egg. What happens is the fertilized egg now secretes human chorionic gonadotropin. And what happens is the HCG, and obviously this is implanted here, actually elongates the lifespan of the corpus luteum. So therefore, your progesterone levels remain constant. At later stages of pregnancy, what happens is there's no longer corpus luteum. The placenta now takes over in the creation of progesterone. And progesterone is actually from the word progestation, which means pro-birth. Okay? So that's what that is. Now what happens if you don't have a fertilized egg? If you don't have a fertilized egg, the corpus luteum dies. Okay? And if the corpus luteum dies, progesterone levels go down. And if the progesterone levels go down, the walls of your endometrial layer now sloughs off and basically gets shed. That is your period at this point. That's your menstrual flow. Okay? And again, the whole cycle continues until you get pregnant. Okay? So again, that's the thing. So be very, very, very cognizant about all of the structural. And I know it's probably very, very confusing for you, but slow down and know which one causes what. So to sum it up, at the very first half, the dominant structure is the follicle. All right. So in response to gonadotropin releasing hormone, a follicle develops. A follicle creates low levels of estrogen initially, but once it gets to a mature follicle size, it creates estrogen. That estrogen results in a spike of luteinizing and follicles, generally speaking, more luteinizing hormone. The spike in LH and FSH expels the egg from the follicle. That's called ovulation. Now the follicle without the egg is now called a corpus luteum. That creates progesterone, and that spike or the increase in progesterone is, in this case, results in the development of the endometrial layer in preparation for the delivery of a developed egg. Okay, if there's an egg, if there's a fertilized egg, okay, if there's a fertilized egg, the corpus luteum keeps going and the progesterone levels remains constant. Okay, if not, the progesterone levels obviously goes down because of corpus luteum regression, and obviously this layer that was developed to be ready for the implantation of fertilized egg actually, in this case, gets sloughed off in the menstrual cycle. This is actually the basis of birth control pills. The birth control pills, which is a mixture of progesterone, basically, because it's high levels, actually makes you not mature a follicle, to not develop a primary, secondary, and a mature follicle. So as a negative feedback loop.